Maria Gonzalez never imagined her search for a better life in America would lead her into the arms of her brother-in-law, Javier. Antonio Gonzalez, her husband, worked tirelessly to build their future, but his absence in their marriage set the stage for betrayal. As Maria's lonely heart gravitated toward the man she once called family, their passionate affair spiraled into a deadly betrayal that would end in murder, shattering not just a marriage, but an entire family's future. Maria Gonzalez had always dreamed of a better life, one filled with opportunity and the promise of something greater than what her small village in Mexico could offer. She arrived in the United States with her husband, Antonio, in search of that elusive hope. Antonio was a man she had barely known before their arranged marriage, a union brought about by family expectations more than personal choice. He was a hard-working man, but distant. His focus on his job at a local factory left little room for emotional connection. Maria, though grateful for the safety of her new life, felt isolated. The culture in the United States was vastly different from what she was accustomed to in Mexico. Everything felt new and intimidating. She didn't speak English well and struggled to find her place in this unfamiliar world. But Maria was determined. She enrolled in English classes at a nearby community center and began making friends with other immigrant women who were in similar situations. These new connections helped her feel less alone, even if her marriage to Antonio remained emotionally distant. Antonio, for his part, was a man of routine. He worked long hours, coming home late, tired and distant. Their relationship was more of a partnership than a romance, with little affection to fill the spaces between them. Maria, for all her hard work and attempts at adjusting to her new life, felt a gnawing emptiness that she couldn't shake. She longed for something more, a deeper connection, something beyond the silence that often filled their home. Then came Javier, Antonio's younger brother, who moved in with them temporarily. Javier had fallen on hard times and needed a place to stay. He was the opposite of Antonio in almost every way. Where Antonio was reserved and serious, Javier was outgoing, charming, and full of life. He had a natural charisma that made everyone around him feel comfortable. He seemed to understand Maria's struggles, and the more she spoke with him, the more she began to appreciate his company. At first, their conversations were innocent enough. Javier would ask Maria about her day, compliment her cooking, and share stories about his own life. He would listen intently when Maria spoke about her challenges adapting to a new country, offering encouragement and understanding. She began to look forward to his company, something that she hadn't felt with Antonio in a long time. Javier's attention was different. It was genuine, warm, and he made her feel seen in a way that Antonio never had. The more time they spent together, the stronger their bond grew. Maria found herself smiling when Javier entered a room, feeling a flutter in her chest that she had not experienced in years. There was a sense of excitement, an unspoken connection that only seemed to grow with every passing day. Though she never intended for it to go any further, there was no denying the attraction between them. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Javier became the person Maria turned to when the loneliness became unbearable. In his company, she felt alive again, and for the first time since arriving in the United States, she believed she might have found the happiness she had been searching for. Unbeknownst to her, Antonio was starting to notice the growing closeness between Maria and Javier. He saw the way they exchanged glances when they thought he wasn't looking, the way their conversations lingered a little too long. At first, he brushed it off, thinking it was nothing. But as the weeks went by, his unease grew. Something was changing in his home, and he couldn't quite put his finger on it. His wife and his brother were growing too close, and Antonio knew that things were no longer as simple as they once seemed. As the weeks went on, the bond between Maria and Javier deepened. What had started as innocent conversations and subtle gestures of kindness soon evolved into something far more complex. Javier's attentiveness towards Maria didn't go unnoticed by her. His gestures, once friendly, had turned into flirtations, small touches when passing by, lingering looks that seemed to speak volumes. It was a form of affection that Maria had never received from Antonio, and it was intoxicating. She was drawn to Javier in ways she had never imagined, captivated by his charm and the way he made her feel special. Javier, for his part, was fully aware of the emotions that were blossoming between them. His feelings for Maria went beyond simple attraction. He admired her resilience, the way she had managed to adapt to a new life in a foreign country. He saw in her the strength he wished he could have himself, and somewhere along the way, his admiration turned into something more, a desire, a longing that he couldn't suppress. Though he knew their relationship was forbidden, Javier couldn't ignore the pull he felt towards Maria. Every glance, every shared moment seemed to draw them closer, despite the barriers they both faced. Maria, torn between her love for Antonio and her growing feelings for Javier, found herself at a crossroads. She had always tried to be a good wife, dutiful and respectful to Antonio, but she couldn't deny the growing desire inside her. Javier made her feel alive, something she hadn't felt in years. His attention filled the empty spaces in her heart that Antonio's distance had created. Yet Maria also felt guilty. She had promised herself to Antonio, even if their marriage had never been built on true passion. But with Javier, the connection was undeniable. She couldn't stop thinking about him, even in the quiet moments when Antonio wasn't around. One evening, after Antonio had left for work, Javier and Maria found themselves alone in the house. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the weight of their feelings hanging heavily between them. As they talked, their usual banter took on a different tone, more intimate, more personal. The conversation veered into territory neither of them had anticipated, and for the first time they both acknowledged the chemistry that had been building for weeks. Javier confessed that he had feelings for her, that he had been struggling with the same desire for weeks. Maria, heart racing, admitted that she felt the same. The words were out there now, spoken aloud, and there was no turning back. What started as a quiet, secret connection now took on a life of its own. The attraction was too strong to ignore. In the days that followed, Maria and Javier found themselves sneaking moments when they could. A quiet touch, a stolen kiss when Antonio wasn't home. It was thrilling, but also dangerous. They both knew the consequences of their actions, but neither could stop the growing pull they had toward each other. Each stolen moment only fueled their desire, making it harder to resist. The guilt was there, but it was overshadowed by the intensity of their feelings. Maria found herself in a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, shame, excitement, and longing. She couldn't shake the thought of what she was doing, but at the same time, she couldn't ignore how Javier made her feel. Their relationship, though secret, began to feel inevitable, and Maria was starting to wonder how much longer they could keep it hidden. The quiet, gentle man she had married seemed like a distant memory. In his place, there was only Javier, fiery, passionate and filled with the kind of love Maria had never known. Antonio, though still largely unaware, began to sense a shift. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what was going on, but there was a palpable tension between his wife and his brother that he could no longer ignore. They were acting differently around him, more distant, avoiding his gaze. The conversations between them were now curt and rushed, and Antonio's suspicion grew. Though he wasn't certain, his gut told him something was wrong, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. Antonio's suspicions had been growing for weeks, but the final piece of the puzzle fell into place on a quiet Tuesday evening. He had come home early from work, a rare occurrence, and found the house unusually silent. The moment he walked through the door, he felt a strange, unsettling stillness in the air. Javier's car wasn't in the driveway, and Maria, usually busy in the kitchen or cleaning, was nowhere to be found. He wandered through the house, eventually hearing the faint sound of her footsteps from the bedroom. Maria was in their room, sitting on the edge of the bed, eyes downcast, as if waiting for something, or perhaps avoiding him. The room felt suffocating, as if the weight of the secret they had been hiding had finally caught up with them. Antonio's heart raced as he stood there, staring at her. His eyes caught sight of something, the phone. Maria's phone, which was sitting on the bedside table, unlocked and left open. For a brief moment, Antonio hesitated. He had never felt the need to invade her privacy, but the unease inside him was too strong to ignore. With trembling hands, he picked up the phone. His eyes scanned the screen, and it didn't take long for him to find the messages. The texts between Maria and Javier were explicit, filled with longing, flirtation, and promises of things left unsaid. Each message hit Antonio like a slap to the face. He read through the conversation, the world around him blurring as anger and disbelief flooded his mind. The words were clear, their meaning unmistakable. Maria had betrayed him with his own brother. The initial shock was overwhelming. Antonio's body went cold and his hands began to shake. He couldn't understand it. His wife, whom he had married in the hope of building a life together, had given herself to Javier, a man he had trusted as a brother. His heart was heavy with betrayal, but something else was growing inside him, a burning fury that clouded all rational thought. His mind raced, struggling to process the horror of what he had just discovered. When Maria finally emerged from the bedroom, her face drained of color, upon seeing Antonio standing there, the phone clutched tightly in his hand. There was no need for words. Antonio could see it in her eyes. The guilt was written all over her face, and for a brief moment their eyes locked. She tried to speak, but no words came. She had been caught, and there was no escaping the truth now. Antonio's rage exploded. His voice, low and seething, was filled with an intensity that Maria had never heard before. He demanded an explanation, his anger rising with every word. The confrontation was raw, painful, and chaotic. Maria tried to apologize, but the words felt hollow. She confessed to the affair, the guilt and shame consuming her, as she admitted to the passion that had ignited between her and Javier. But the explanation didn't matter anymore. The damage had been done, and Antonio's heart was broken beyond repair. In the moments that followed, the tension in the room was suffocating. Antonio's anger was palpable, and Maria could feel the coldness of his betrayal turning into something much darker. He was no longer the man she had married, the man who had been distant but dependable. He was a stranger, a man consumed by grief and fury. Maria stood frozen, unsure of how to fix the irreparable damage, knowing deep down that their marriage was beyond saving. Antonio's fury only grew as he processed the magnitude of the betrayal. His mind raced with thoughts of revenge, and his body tensed with the desire to lash out, to make her feel the pain he was experiencing. Maria, in her guilt and despair, could only stand there, silently pleading for forgiveness. But it was clear that Antonio had already made up his mind. His love for her had been shattered, replaced by something far darker, something he could not control. In the midst of the chaos, there was a sudden, terrible clarity. Antonio realized that his marriage was over, and everything he had believed in was a lie. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had shared his life with, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. As he stood there looking at Maria, his heart filled with rage, confusion, and a deep sense of loss. He knew that the path ahead would lead to something far worse, something that neither of them could undo. But it didn't matter. Something inside Antonio had snapped, and in that moment, he could only focus on one thing: the overwhelming desire for vengeance. The days after Antonio's confrontation with Maria were filled with tension and silence. The once quiet home now felt like a war zone. Antonio's mood shifted from cold detachment to explosive bursts of anger. He had become a stranger to Maria, his eyes devoid of the affection they once held, now clouded with fury and distrust. The love they had shared was shattered beyond repair, replaced by the constant weight of betrayal that hung in the air. Maria, unable to escape the suffocating atmosphere, remained withdrawn, overwhelmed by guilt, but also filled with fear. She had never seen Antonio like this. His rage was all-consuming, leaving her paralyzed and unsure of what to do next. Maria tried as best as she could to rebuild some semblance of peace between them, but Antonio was distant, often lost in his thoughts or avoiding her entirely. His bitterness toward her had hardened into something far more dangerous, something dark that made her wonder if the man she had married was still there at all. At night, when the house was quiet and everyone had gone to bed, Antonio would lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind swirling with dark thoughts. He couldn't escape the betrayal that echoed in his mind. His feelings of hurt and confusion gnawed at him. But it was the rage, the insatiable rage, that refused to be quieted. Maria, consumed by regret, wanted to leave, to escape the torment that had replaced the life she had once known. But Antonio made it clear that she couldn't leave, not without facing the consequences. He locked the doors, kept a tight watch on her, and made it impossible for her to even step out for a moment of air. He spoke less and less, but when he did, his words were sharp, filled with venom, and each sentence cut deeper than the last. He blamed her for everything: the destruction of their marriage, the broken trust, the lies, and his accusations became more erratic as the days wore on. One evening, after dinner, Maria tried to talk to Antonio. She wanted to apologize again, to explain that she was sorry for everything, but the words caught in her throat. Antonio was sitting at the table, staring into space, his jaw clenched tight. When she spoke, he didn't look at her. He didn't say anything at first, but his silence was more oppressive than anything else. Then he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. He told her that there was no coming back from what had happened, that nothing could fix what had been broken. In that moment, Maria realized that the man she had once known was gone, replaced by someone filled with too much pain, too much resentment. She had pushed him too far. He was no longer the man she had married, the man who worked long hours and came home tired, but still loved her in his own way. Now he was consumed by something darker, something that was impossible to ignore. His eyes, once filled with care, now burned with an intensity that terrified her. Antonio's anger began to take on a more violent edge. He started breaking things in the house, punching walls, smashing plates, throwing things across rooms. Maria could feel the air crackling with tension, like a storm was about to break. She was afraid to be in the same room with him, afraid of what might happen if she said the wrong thing, or if he snapped again. Every conversation with him was like walking on glass, each word carefully chosen, each gesture full of hesitation. One night, after another particularly violent outburst, Maria packed a bag. She couldn't take it anymore. She was terrified of what Antonio might do next. She needed to leave, to escape this nightmare. But before she could even make it to the door, Antonio stopped her. His hands were shaking, his face pale and twisted with emotion. He told her she wasn't going anywhere. She was his wife, and he had no intention of letting her go. The door was locked, the windows were shut, and there was no way for her to escape. In the tension-filled silence that followed, Maria could only feel a sense of growing dread. Antonio had crossed a line, and she knew that there was no turning back. She had seen the way he looked at her, the cold, calculating stare of a man who had already made up his mind. She tried to reason with him, to beg him to let her go, but the words fell flat. Antonio wasn't listening anymore. He was consumed by a need to punish, a need for vengeance that had overtaken everything else. With each passing day, Antonio's temper became more erratic. His behavior was unpredictable, and Maria had no idea what would set him off next. She had no choice but to stay, trapped in a house that once held love, now filled with tension, fear, and the ever-present spectre of violence. What had once been a home now felt like a prison, and Maria could sense that the worst was yet to come. The dark thoughts that had been festering inside Antonio were beginning to take form, and Maria knew that, at any moment, things could spiral completely out of control. The final night of Maria's life began like any other, though there was a quiet dread hanging in the air. Antonio had been distant all day, barely speaking, his eyes hollow with a mixture of grief and fury. Maria had tried to make the house feel normal, to pretend that everything could somehow go back to how it was before, the time before Javier, before the affair, before the betrayal. But it was impossible. The cracks in their marriage were too deep, and the distance between them had grown to a chasm that no amount of effort could bridge. Antonio had been volatile in the days leading up to that night. His mood swings were unpredictable. One moment, he was cold and silent. The next, he was lashing out, shouting at her, accusing her of things she didn't even understand. Maria was a prisoner in her own home, unable to escape his reach. She had tried to talk to him, to explain that it was over, that nothing could fix what had happened, but his anger only grew stronger. He had made it clear that she wasn't going anywhere, and the walls around her seemed to close in tighter with each passing hour. That evening, Maria had hoped for a small reprieve. Antonio had gone to bed early, something that seemed odd to her, but she didn't think much of it. She sat in the living room, nervously flipping through a magazine, the silence of the house oppressive. The phone calls with her friends had become infrequent. She was afraid of them hearing the truth, of them knowing the extent of her misery. Her loneliness had never been more profound. She thought about leaving again, trying to slip away when Antonio wasn't around, but the fear of his violent outbursts kept her rooted to the house, unsure of how to move forward. The house was dim, the only light coming from the flickering television screen. Maria heard footsteps behind her, slow and heavy. When she turned, she saw Antonio standing in the doorway. His face was unreadable, his eyes darkened with emotion she couldn't place. He said nothing at first, just stood there watching her. The tension between them thickened in the silence, and Maria's heart began to race. She stood up slowly, her hands trembling at her sides. "I didn't want it to come to this," Antonio said, his voice low, almost cold. Maria opened her mouth to speak, to apologize again. But before she could, Antonio continued, "You've destroyed everything, Maria. You've destroyed us." The words were like a slap, each one landing hard in her chest. She could feel the weight of the years of silence, of the years of disappointment, and the betrayal settling between them. Antonio stepped forward, and Maria instinctively took a step back. She wanted to run, but the door was too far, and Antonio was too close. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted. Antonio's anger flared, and before Maria could react, he grabbed her by the arm. She winced in pain, but he didn't let go. His grip was like iron, and his eyes were wild, filled with a rage she had never seen before. The man she had once loved was gone, replaced by a monster who no longer seemed to care about anything except the suffocating need for control. "Antonio, please," Maria begged, her voice shaking. "I never meant to hurt you. Please, just let me go." But Antonio was beyond reasoning. His face twisted with rage, and in one sudden movement he pushed her to the floor. Maria cried out in shock, her body crashing against the cold hardwood. For a moment she was disoriented, but the fear kicked in. She tried to scramble to her feet to get away, but Antonio was already on her, his hand clamping down on her throat. Maria's breath caught in her chest as the world around her began to blur. She gasped for air, her hands clutching at his arm, trying to push him away, but he was too strong. The struggle felt like it lasted an eternity, each second slipping by slower than the last. Her vision dimmed, and her body grew weaker, the pain and the fear mixing into one overwhelming sensation. She wanted to scream, but there was no air left in her lungs to do so. As her strength waned, a single thought ran through her mind. How had it come to this? How had the man she had once called her husband become the one to take her life? The answer, buried in the grief and anger of their broken lives, was painfully clear. In the darkness of that final moment, as the last breath left her body, Maria realized that her escape, her chance for a new life, had been taken from her long ago. By the time Javier returned home that night, he found the house eerily quiet. He called out for Maria, but there was no answer. When he reached the living room, his heart sank. Antonio stood over Maria's lifeless body, a look of madness in his eyes, a knife in his hand. Javier's breath caught in his throat as he saw the man he had once called a brother, the man who had been his family, standing there drenched in the consequences of his own actions.